At 4 a.m. in Brussels, after 19 straight hours locked behind closed doors, Europe's most powerful leaders finally stepped back into the light. Their faces said everything: pale, drained, like people who had just stared down something they didn't fully understand. And blinked. For months, the story had been simple. The European Union was going to take $105 billion from frozen Russian assets and turn it into weapons and aid for Ukraine. It was framed as justice. Make the aggressor pay. No new taxes. No new debt. Just take Moscow's money and move on. But that's not what happened. Instead, the cameras caught a quiet reversal. The seizure was scrapped. The reparations loan was killed. And in its place, the EU announced something far more dangerous for ordinary people. Another massive borrowing plan, nearly $90 billion to be repaid by European taxpayers for decades to come. And that raised the question no headline wanted to touch. Why would any government walk away from what looked like free money? Why abandon a plan that had been marketed as a moral victory, only to dump the cost on its own citizens in the middle of inflation and economic fatigue? The official explanation was vague talk about technical issues and legal complexity, but that story doesn't survive even 5 minutes of real scrutiny. Because behind that locked door in Brussels was a nightmare scenario nobody wanted made public. A secret lawsuit prepared in Moscow, a little-known financial company that quietly holds the entire European economy together, and a private warning from Europe's top central bankers that touching this money could blow up the euro itself. And once you see what they were really afraid of, that 4 a.m. surrender suddenly starts to look less like politics and more like survival. Everyone pictured the frozen Russian money sitting in some giant underground vault, guarded by soldiers, just waiting to be scooped up. That image couldn't be more wrong. Roughly $260 billion of Russian central bank assets were frozen after the war began, but almost none of it is in government hands. About $191 billion of it is sitting inside one company most people have never heard of, tucked away in Belgium. Its name is Euroclear. Euroclear isn't a bank. It doesn't give loans. It doesn't speculate. It does something far more dangerous to break. It quietly moves ownership behind the scenes. When someone buys French bonds, German stocks, or government debt from almost anywhere in Europe, Euroclear is the invisible system that makes the transaction legally real. It is the financial plumbing of the continent. Every day, this single company processes tens of trillions in trades for clients across nearly 100 countries, pension funds, governments, central banks. It is the beating heart of Europe's capital markets, and hardly anyone outside the industry even knows it exists. And that's the terrifying part. If Euroclear ever stopped functioning, not for weeks, not for days, but even for a few hours, trading across Europe would freeze, settlements would fail, banks wouldn't know who owns what, confidence would evaporate. It wouldn't look like a recession. It would look like a heart attack. So when people talk casually about seizing Russia's money, they aren't talking about grabbing cash from a vault. They're talking about reaching directly into the most delicate piece of financial machinery Europe has. And that's where the temptation appeared. Because while the principle was frozen, something else was quietly piling up inside Euroclear, growing larger every single day. Those frozen Russian assets weren't just sitting there collecting dust. Many of them were government bonds that quietly matured over time. And when bonds mature, they turn into cash. But because of sanctions, Euroclear couldn't send that cash back to Moscow, so it just sat there, trapped inside the system, slowly stacking up, month after month, earning interest. By late 2025, that trapped money had quietly grown into a multi-billion-dollar pile that nobody had really planned for. That's when Ursula von der Leyen's team thought they had cracked the code. They wouldn't touch the main Russian assets. That would be legally explosive. Instead, they'd take only the interest, the so-called windfall cash created by sanctions. It sounded clean, technical, almost boring. The idea was to use that interest stream as collateral for a massive $105 billion loan to Ukraine. Investors would get repaid over time using the trapped Russian profits, not taxpayer money. On paper, it was brilliant. Justice without pain, morality without cost. Inside Brussels, people started calling it free money. But finance has a brutal rule. If something looks risk-free, it usually means you just don't see the risk yet. Because the moment Europe decided to touch even €1 of that trapped cash, it crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. And while officials were congratulating themselves on finding the perfect workaround, something else was happening far from Brussels. Something far more calculated, far more dangerous. While Europe was celebrating, Moscow was sharpening its knives. 1 week before Europe's leaders were due to meet in Brussels, a document landed in a Moscow arbitration court that changed everything. It wasn't a press release. It wasn't a speech. It was a lawsuit. Russia's central bank accused Euroclear of illegally withholding its money and declared the company in default. The claim was staggering. 18 trillion rubles, roughly $229 billion once converted. Not just the value of the frozen assets, but punitive damages on top. At first glance, it looked like theater. A Russian court ruling against a Belgian company? Who would even enforce that? But this is where the trap snapped shut. Euroclear doesn't just hold Russian money in Belgium, it also holds Western assets inside Russia. And European banks, pension funds, and investment firms still have billions trapped there in what are known as restricted accounts. They can't move the money, but it still legally exists. So Moscow's message wasn't symbolic, it was surgical. If Europe touched that $105 billion in Brussels, Russia would declare Euroclear insolvent in its own courts and seize Western money inside Russia to cover the judgment. The Kremlin would drain European banks to pay itself back. This was called symmetrical retaliation. Not missiles, not tanks, balance sheets. And suddenly the seizure plan didn't look like justice anymore. It looked like a financial boomerang, one that could come screaming back through the heart of the European banking system. And that's when Belgium finally understood what was happening. This wasn't Europe versus Russia. This was Belgium being positioned as the sacrificial lamb. The moment that lawsuit became real, the entire map of the crisis shifted. This was no longer about punishing Russia. It was about one country being forced to absorb a disaster that could wipe out its financial system. Euroclear is headquartered in Belgium. It's regulated by Belgium. And if Russia went nuclear with retaliation, it wouldn't be Europe on the hook, it would be Belgium. That's when Prime Minister Bart de Wever finally broke his silence. Behind closed doors, he told the other leaders that Belgium was not going to jump off a cliff alone. If Europe wanted to play financial warfare using assets sitting on Belgian soil, then every EU country had to share the consequences. He demanded an ironclad indemnity, a written guarantee that if Russia sued Euroclear into oblivion, if Western assets were seized in Moscow, if the legal avalanche started rolling, then Germany, France, Italy, everyone would split the bill. And that's when the room went quiet. The same leaders who had been loud about moral duty suddenly found reasons to stall. The numbers were too large. The risks were too unpredictable. The lawyers needed more time. In public, they still talked about unity. In private, unity collapsed the moment real liability appeared. Because it's easy to spend someone else's money. It's much harder to sign a contract saying you'll pay when the bomb goes off. And just when the politicians were deadlocked, a different group stepped in. The people who don't care about speeches or headlines. The bankers had seen the math, and they were about to kill the plan for good. While politicians were still arguing about who would carry the legal risk, a far more dangerous message arrived from Frankfurt. Christine Lagarde, head of the European Central Bank, sent a confidential warning to the negotiating teams. It wasn't meant for headlines, it wasn't meant to leak, but its implications were devastating. The ECB refused to act as a backstop. That single sentence changed everything. Normally, when financial systems wobble, central banks step in. They print money, flood markets with liquidity, and prevent panic from spreading. But this time, the ECB made it clear, if Euroclear was hit with lawsuits, asset seizures, or insolvency threats, because of this Russian money plan, the ECB would not rescue it. Why? Because this wasn't just about Ukraine. It was about the very status of the euro itself. The euro is the world's second most important reserve currency. Central banks in countries like Brazil, Saudi Arabia, and Indonesia hold trillions in euro-denominated assets for one reason. They believe Europe respects property rights, even when politics gets ugly. The moment Europe seizes sovereign assets, even under the polite label of a windfall tax, that trust evaporates. The signal to the rest of the world would be chillingly simple. Your money is safe in Europe, until we don't like you anymore. And when trust dies, money runs. Lagarde warned that central banks would start dumping euros, moving into gold, dollars, or yuan. Bond markets would spike. Borrowing costs for European governments would explode. Inflation, which everyone thought was finally under control, would come roaring back. In short, the euro itself could go into freefall. So the ECB stepped away. No safety net, no bailout, no money printer to save the system if it cracked. And just as fear reached its peak inside that Brussels room, one country made a move that finished the plan for good. Rome had finally made up its mind. Italy had supported the idea of squeezing Russian money from the start. On the surface, it looked like a clean way to help Ukraine without hurting voters. But once Moscow's threats became concrete, that moral stance started colliding with something far more fragile. Italy's own banking system. Italian banks never fully left Russia. Unicredit, in particular, still had billions locked inside the country. They couldn't pull it out, but it was sitting there like a hostage, waiting for the Kremlin to decide its fate. And under Russia's new legal strategy, that money was suddenly in the crosshairs. If Euroclear was declared in default by a Russian court, Moscow wouldn't stop at Belgian assets. They would begin seizing the stranded funds of European banks operating inside Russia to satisfy the judgment. Italian banks would be among the first to bleed. Giorgia Meloni saw the trap forming in real time. This wasn't about standing up to Moscow anymore. It was about whether Italian pension funds, shareholders, and retirees would end up paying the price for a financial war they never agreed to fight. So she switched sides. In closed-door meetings, Meloni aligned Italy with Belgium. She argued that proceeding without a rock-solid legal foundation wasn't courageous, it was reckless. And without Italy, the fragile consensus inside the EU shattered. The $105 billion dream was now hanging by a thread. But the final blow wasn't coming from Europe at all. Hovering over that room was a ghost from across the Atlantic, and everyone could feel it. Throughout the final weeks of 2025, European capitals had been receiving quiet messages from Washington. Not from the outgoing administration, but from the incoming one. Donald Trump's transition team was already laying out its vision for the war, and it was nothing like the previous approach. To them, those frozen Russian assets weren't a cash machine. They were leverage. The logic was brutally transactional. If Europe seized the money and spent it on weapons, then there was nothing left to bargain with. No incentive for Moscow to negotiate. But if the assets stayed frozen, they could be offered back in a future deal. A ceasefire, territorial concessions, some kind of face-saving exit. Burn the assets now and you burn the leverage forever. European leaders understood the message immediately. Trump wasn't even in office yet, and already the ground rules were changing. Nobody wanted to be the person who provoked the next American president, the man who would soon control NATO's future, by destroying what he saw as the strongest bargaining chip on the table. So even leaders who still believed in the seizure plan began hesitating, not because they had suddenly grown sympathetic to Russia, but because they were terrified of being out of step with Washington at the worst possible moment. And just when it seemed the plan couldn't get any more fragile, lawyers uncovered something buried deep in Europe's legal archives. A forgotten agreement from the Cold War era that would turn the entire scheme into a legal minefield. A treaty no one had expected to matter ever again. The document was over 3 decades old, yellowed with time, signed in a world that technically no longer exists. In 1989, Belgium and the Soviet Union had signed a bilateral investment treaty. It was designed to protect investors from political abuse. It promised something simple but absolute: no expropriation without compensation. When the USSR collapsed, Russia inherited that treaty, and nobody in Brussels had thought about it since. Until now, legal teams began tearing through its language, and what they found was devastating. The treaty didn't just discourage asset seizures, it flat out prohibited them, and it didn't limit enforcement to Belgian courts. Russia could sue Belgium in neutral arbitration hubs, Hong Kong, Singapore, Dubai, jurisdictions that specialize in enforcing international investment law. And under that treaty, Belgium would almost certainly lose. The consequences weren't abstract. If Russia won, it could enforce the ruling anywhere in the world. Belgian state-owned assets could be seized on foreign soil, ships impounded in ports, aircraft grounded on runways, even diplomatic accounts frozen. A decision made in Brussels could echo across the globe, turning Belgian property into collateral damage in a financial war nobody had truly understood. By the time the leaders realized what that forgotten treaty meant, the room had gone silent. It was nearly 4 a.m. The illusion was dead, and suddenly the only question left wasn't how to take Russia's money, but how to pay the bill themselves. By the time the final coffee cups were emptied and the doors reopened to the cameras, the grand plan was already a corpse. The reparations loan was dead. There would be no $105 billion extracted from Russian assets, no financial punishment headline. Instead, the European Union would do what it always does when reality collides with politics. It would borrow. Nearly $90 billion would be raised on the bond markets, backed by the EU budget. Translation: European taxpayers would pay the interest, shoulder the risk, and live with the debt for decades. The money for Ukraine would still flow, but the cost would now show up slowly in higher taxes, reduced spending, and tighter budgets across the continent. To save face, leaders announced a compromise. The Russian assets wouldn't be seized, but they wouldn't be released either. They would remain frozen indefinitely, held hostage until some future moment when reparations were paid or peace was signed. It sounded tough, it looked decisive, but in truth it was a retreat dressed up as resolve. Because Moscow had achieved exactly what it wanted without firing a single shot. The threat of symmetrical retaliation, legal chaos, and financial collapse had worked. Europe blinked. Russia kept its money, and Europe sent the bill to its own citizens instead. For years, people have believed that politics sits on top of the financial system. The leaders can simply decide who pays and who doesn't. That if the cause is moral enough, the rules bend. That illusion died in Brussels. In a room full of presidents and prime ministers, it wasn't outrage or solidarity that decided the outcome. It was spreadsheets, lawsuits, balance sheets. The fear of watching the entire European financial system unravel in real time. The EU didn't walk away from $105 billion because it lost its nerve. It walked away because it stared straight into the machinery that keeps Europe alive. the plumbing of markets, the trust behind reserve currencies, the legal architecture built over decades, and realized that pulling the wrong lever could trigger a collapse no summit could undo. So they blinked. The war goes on, the Russian assets remain frozen, the speeches about unity keep coming, but the bill didn't disappear, it just quietly changed names, and now, whether anyone tells you or not, it has your name on it.